So opening our Bibles at Mark 5, and I'm going to read the first part again, just so that it's fresh in our minds as Chris comes to teach from it. We're going to be reading this time verses 21 all the way through to 43. Has everyone got a Bible? Yeah, it looks like it. Brill. Okay. A dead girl and a sick woman. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him whilst he was by the lake. And then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out for him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see people in the crowd, people crowding against you," his disciple answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking round to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koan," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told her to give her something to eat. In a moment, Chris will come and preach, but shall we pray for him first? Father, thank you for this passage. Thank you for these two incredible stories of unbelievable things happening, unbelievable in human terms, but in your terms, Lord, anything is possible. And I pray for Chris as he teaches from this now, Lord. I pray that your Spirit will be guiding him and helping him just say the right words that will speak into our hearts this morning. Help us to be open to you, changing our lives, Lord. Amen.
Good. Well, if we could, I think I've just got one slide today, so if that could go up, that would be useful. Very warm welcome to everyone. Happy birthday to Don, by the way. 83 years young today, Don. Don't look a day over 82. Right, those of you that have been here for a few weeks or a couple of months when we started this series in Mark's Gospel may recognise that slide. I've resurrected it just for this morning, just to help again, just to put in these two amazing incidents into the context that we've seen. I think, as Lou said, this has been a favourite passage of mine really for a long, long time, just watching Jesus deal with these people and these needs is quite extraordinary. But in terms of the context of some of what we've been seeing in Mark and in this series, we've pointed out, and on one of the weeks we went right the way back to the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, and kind of pointed out that evil sits behind all the sort of dysfunctionality that we're so familiar with in our world. Book of Genesis makes it clear that evil sort of invaded the Garden of Eden, tempted the first people that God had made to sin, to turn against God, to do their own thing. And we saw in the judgment of God that produced death. Everything died in a sense. Their relationship with God was marred, and there was a spiritual death. They were going to die now physically. Their bodies would go wrong and death would come physically. And then, of course, the whole world held accountable in judgment, and the prospect, in a sense, of eternal death, of being separated from God. So that's sort of Genesis 1, 2 and 3 puts all of those things up right at the beginning of the Bible story. And we know that evil then sort of brings about sin within people, and that sin then produces all sorts of things. It's a sort of calamity, really, as we begin the Bible's story. And the blue boxes at the bottom pretty much describe the world that we live in. They're actually describing the world of Mark's Gospel in chapters 4 and 5, and these 4 great incidents that Mark brings before us. The problem of evil is something that philosophers and university students and theological students and they knock around the sort of football of the problem of evil. Some try to use it to disprove the existence of God. Some even use evil to argue for the existence of God. But what we see in Mark 4 and 5 and what we know in our own lives is that this isn't a philosophical plaything. Disasters in chapter 4, demons, evil, chapter 5, disease, chapter 5, death, chapter 5, are a huge reality in our lives. I wanted to do a bit more research, but didn't manage to in the end. But, you just think of the disasters. We were praying before church this morning about wars and the thousands and thousands of lives that are impacted by wars now and have been throughout the centuries. The impact of evil, the way that it warps our thinking, the way that it causes us to respond to others, and the way that we treat other people, devastation and the suffering that's caused, sickness, hospitals full. I mean, we talk again as if it's almost a theoretical problem for a new government to come in and sort of ease the pressures on the health service or the hospital. It's a huge challenge, isn't it? And the reality is it's a challenge. Yes, there may be wisdom or less wisdom in how we deal with the system, but the problem is that the people are sick. The problem is disease that keeps on growing and multiplying and changing and has done for hundreds and thousands of years. It's not just a theoretical political problem to be solved. Real lives are caught up in this, and death is an ever-present member, as we will all face it. And as it takes loved ones, friends, family from us. The world, Mark in chapters 4 and 5 puts these 4 great kind of enemies, if you like, of the human race. A fallen creation, disasters, evil, sickness and death. And he lines them up very deliberately together in this section. We see a world of disorder, of chaos, of futility, of harm, of hurt, of sickness and death. A world that we see, and it's just been a brilliant sort of introduction to this morning, a world that Jesus walks into and has absolute control. And not just absolute control, but we see, and we'll see this, I hope, this morning, a caring control in all of these situations. We noticed, and we have noticed a couple of things as we've gone along. We've noticed that Jesus is unaffected by the mess himself. Throughout Mark, a lot of these situations are linked with cleanliness and uncleanness. The leper, he's unwell, but he's unclean. Jesus is eating with sinners and tax collectors, those that are viewed as being unclean. This woman with bleeding of 12 years under the law is seen as unclean. Jesus mixes with these people. The man with the demons, Legion, in the tombs, unclean. Jesus mixes with them and is unaffected by the mess. The general thinking, and apologies, I've said this 100 times, the general thinking in Jesus' day is the sort of mouldy Satsuma thinking that the uncleanness spreads to those around, that the health and the vibrancy and the beautifulness of a lovely orange Satsuma surrounding the mouldy one doesn't move in and affect the mould moves out. And that would be the expectation of Jesus in this messy, unclean world. And yet his purity and his cleanliness moves to the unclean, not the other way around. He fixes the mess and he fixes it with ease. I think this is the thing that's striking me week in, week out as we go along. Jesus simply speaks. We have others in the Bible, in the Old Testament, I'm thinking of, where God does amazing miracles, but often they do a huge amount of things physically or prayer-wise or whatever to make this healing happen. But Jesus just sort of walks onto the scene, doesn't he? To the leper, I am willing, be clean. And immediately the leprosy leaves him. Stood in that raging storm, quiet to the wind, be still to the waves, and they respond immediately. Come out of this man, and the legion of spirits responds, little girl, get up. This is literally all it took. Sorry to give the ending away, but you've had the reading already. Little girl, get up. And the dead live. It's astonishing. I know there's a few dog owners, I don't know why my mind went to this, few dog owners in the church. I find it quite comical, actually, crossing the common to come to the church now and then during the week to see a variety of dog owners. Apparently, different ones walk at different times of day, so you've got your little dog walker friends. And there's a huge range of control and no control that you see as you cross the common. The sort of dog owner desperately running after this thing who's having none of it, not looking at anyone at all at this moment. But then you notice the difference, don't you? The one that almost just speaks. And the dog is just sort of there, you know. And I guess I've never been to one of these, but I imagine a dog training sort of show competition must be astonishing, the way that this animal does exactly what it's commanded. I don't know if you saw on the news, the BMX hopeful, Olympic hopeful, was just a short item on this person who they showed footage of him, you know, on his BMX. First one, I think, to do some sort of triple somersault thing with a twist. And I was just watching the bike's spinning, it's doing all this sort of thing, but he's in complete and utter control. And I hope he doesn't come crashing down at the Olympics. But, you know, they're silly examples in a way, but they sort of bring about the response in Mark 4:41 of the storm with open-mouthed, who is this? Who is this? With such control just to speak to nature, evil, sickness, death. I think for some of us, if we've been Christians some time and we've been familiar with the Gospels for some time, it's a real downside, isn't it, that we can become so familiar with these sort of incidents. We just know what's going to happen. We've read them before. It's a real shame that we've lost the shock factor. Those disciples we read in the boat are terrified at what they've just seen Jesus do. The townspeople coming and seeing the man who had a legion of evil spirits terrorizing the whole community. They see him sat there, dressed and in his right mind, and they're afraid. Afraid of Jesus, afraid of someone with such control and such power. They beg him to leave the region. That was last week. And now after the Jairus and his daughter raised to life in verse 42, the people are completely and utterly astonished at what they see. So what we see in these four incidents, and we see in the two that we're looking at this morning, is that Jesus sort of enters this world that is, in a sense, under the power of evil, the God of this age kind of ruling the roost, having messed up the world or appearing to rule the roost. Jesus enters the world of disorder and chaos, futility, hurt, harm, sickness and death. And he just deals with it without any fuss, with complete authority, simply with a word. And yet, I've said it, he enters it with a caring control. And it's that I want us to notice this morning. I don't think any of us can lose sight of the power of Jesus. But notice the way in which he deals with people. It starts really in the boat, I think, when the disciples wake Jesus, who's sleeping in this storm, and they say to him, "Don't you care if we drown?" And what we're going to notice this morning is that Jesus cares a huge amount, and often his care comes in a way in which we don't see or we don't expect, or it's difficult to see. So Jesus, when they say, "Don't you care?" he stands up and he stills the storm. He preserves their lives. So you could say, well, that's him showing his care. But what does he then say to them? He says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" So he's cared for their physical needs, he's kept them safe, but he wants to care for them in another way. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Do you not see me? Do you not know me? The response of the crowd to the demon-possessed man was to chain him up. Jesus' response was to free him and then to include him in the growth of Jesus' kingdom. He doesn't allow him to come with Jesus into the boat, but he tells him, "Go and tell your friends, go and tell your family, tell them what the Lord has done for you. Go and sow the seed. Be about, in a sense, my kingdom's work." And as I said last week, we don't quite know what that led to. We know how the people responded when Jesus returned to that area, but we don't know the ins and outs. But Jesus cared for this man not only by helping him to be there, sat, dressed and in his right mind, free from a legion of evil spirits, but Jesus then takes this unclean man, once unclean man, and sends him about his service. He cares for him in more than just taking away the evil spirits. And we'll see Jesus' care here now displayed in the lives of the two main characters in the incidents that have been read to us. A woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. Most of the commentators think this is a sort of a menstrual sort of issue and blood flow and a constant thing that was not right, not a regular experience. She's been to doctors on and off for 12 years trying to solve this puzzle. A woman who bled for 12 years and a man whose daughter is dying. One assaulted by disease, the other assaulted by death. One branded as unclean under the Jewish law, cut off from the community. The other a prominent, high-status religious leader in the community. Poles apart, and yet both utterly desperate, both fearful, and both cared for here by Jesus. Just look down again at the passage. I know we've had this read a few times now, but have a look down at verse 22. They've crossed again to the other side of the lake. And in verse 22, we find Jairus. Mark introduces Jairus. Think of the stage, as it were. The synagogue leader, Jairus, enters onto the stage, into the scene. He comes and he sees Jesus. He falls at his feet. He pleads earnestly with him. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him. We see three things here. We're going to see the same things with the woman. There's an empathizing, isn't there, here with Jairus? His desperation. I don't think you need to be a parent to sort of empathize with Jairus. But if you are, you'll know, won't you, something of this, the desperation. For a synagogue leader, ruler, to come in a public place like that and fall down at Jesus' feet is astonishing. We've had the king, haven't we, on our jigsaw. I mean, you don't often see that, do you? The idea of somebody so prominent and respected to come and fall at Jesus' feet and to plead with him. So we can empathise with Jairus. There is some kind of faith in there, isn't there? It's hard to know quite how to describe it, but there's something of faith in the second, in verse 23, pleading earnestly, "Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." There's something. He obviously knows something about Jesus. Again, we never know what, do we? Never know the backstory of these things. Maybe Maybe he was there when the leper, or maybe he was one of the people that the leper came to. I haven't looked at the geography, so it may or may not be. But how the leprosy and how they told how Jesus touched him and the leprosy went. Maybe he'd heard about the paralyzed man and the use of his legs coming back. We don't know. But he knows enough to know in this desperate, desperate situation that if you would only come with me, if you would only place your hands on her, then she can be healed and she can live. There's some trust, there's some faith, there's something there with Jairus. And then utter relief, thirdly, in verse 24, as Jesus agrees to go with him. There must be such hope on that sort of brink of losing your child that Jesus has agreed to come with him. So at this point in verse 24, that Mark then introduces the woman. Verse 24, 25, the large crowd is following. They're heading to Jairus' home, and a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, spent all that she had, yet instead of growing better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd, touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Again, it's another character, isn't it, that we can empathise with. 12 years. 12 years with this condition. 12 years toing and froing from the doctor. The physical impact of what this meant. She could feel, couldn't she, in her body that something had changed. So she was therefore aware of whatever it felt like for 12 years. The mental impact, the emotional impact of that, constant suffering, no respite. On top of that, as we saw, the same with the leper, that where there are certain categories of uncleanness under the Old Testament law. Leprosy was one of them. Blood was another. If you were to cut yourself going about your gardening or whatever, you become unclean with that blood coming out. So this woman is in that category of being unclean. She's, in a sense, out on the edges of the community, separated. There's a loneliness, there's a terrible burden that she's bearing there. Reminds me of so many people, perhaps those that are suffering with ME, over years and years and years, a constant companion every day in your thinking, in your mind as well as your body. Those with long COVID, people with chronic, constant pain, day in, day out, no respite. That was this woman. And like Jairus, there seems to be some kind of faith. Some of the books you read talk about it as quasi-faith or superstitious faith. I don't know if that's too harsh, I don't know. But she knew if she could get to Jesus, she knew if she could just touch his clothes. Verse 27, 28, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. There's something, isn't there, again from what she's heard, drawing her to Jesus. And then the same relief, verse 29, not just the hope that Jesus might come and save his daughter, but in this case, the relief of immediate healing, verse 29. Immediately the bleeding stopped. She felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Let's think just about Jesus' care for this woman. There's something hidden here that is not immediately sort of obvious to us as we read in Mark's Gospel. There's something hidden here. Let me just sort of point this out to you. If you have a look at verse 28, just have a sip of water. Just have a look at verse 28 and have a read through of that. Now, before we get to that, because this is going to be a language thing, I want you just to sort of imagine for a minute how this woman feels in verse 29. The bleeding has stopped. She feels in her body that she's free from her suffering. She must be absolutely thrilled that this has happened, overjoyed, relieved. I imagine her at this moment, and just do forgive this for a minute, but I imagine the joy inside, but can barely contain herself, probably cheering or doing something. But I imagine her now just beginning to sort of slowly creep away. I don't know if you get that sort of impression. She shouldn't have been there as an unclean person under the law. She shouldn't have been there. She shouldn't be probably touching a rabbi anyway, but certainly not in an unclean state. I imagine she wants to just creep away quietly, is my guess. It's a bit like we have a lovely routine, well, it's lovely for us. When we finish dinner in the evening, Henry always unloads the dishwasher. We're very fortunate to have a dishwasher and very fortunate to have someone that unloads it after every meal. And he'll often just go and do it, or he'll say, I'm going to go and do the dishwasher, or he'll say, does the dishwasher need doing? Sorry to you younger people whose parents are now looking at them. But occasionally, and often if he's just started playing a new game with his friends, online gaming, you'll notice him stand up, he'll take his plate to the kitchen, you'll hear it go down, and then you'll see him beginning to creep down the hallway. And then, and I'm drawing a parallel between Henry and this woman at this point, it's when he hears the word Henry that he knows the game's up. This woman, as I said, shouldn't have been there really, not in amongst people in this way, not in a crowd that's all pressing up against each other, not touching a rabbi, and not touching a rabbi in an unclean state. She feels the healing within, and I imagine she's making her exit when she hears the word Henry, or in Jesus' case, in verse 30, who touched my clothes? And I just imagine in some comic way her beginning to stop. Who touched my clothes? I wonder on the surface, and it's not right of us obviously to question Jesus, but I wonder on the surface what's going on here. I remember being at school in English classes, just spending most of my time in the lesson hoping against hope that I wouldn't be asked to read the book out loud in front of the class. I was petrified of that happening. It was my worst nightmare. And Jesus, we know, knows all things, and we know because he has a divine nature. He is God in a human body. He knows this woman. He knows who's touched him. He knows her fear. He knows that she shouldn't be there. So why is he asking, who touched my clothes? And I think, and this is where we return to verse 28, that there's something here that we don't easily see. So have a look again at verse 28. The NIV translators here are trying to be helpful, and in trying to be helpful, they've slightly masked something. So in verse 28 or 27, we're told she heard about Jesus. She came up behind him in the crowd, and she touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be... And the word isn't healed. If I just touch his clothes, I will be saved. Now, the NIV translators are trying to be helpful because they're thinking, well, it's all about healing, and the next bit's all about healing. In verse 29, we're told immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. She was healed. But let's just follow the actual words. Verse 28, if I touch his clothes, I will be saved. Not just healed, yes, but saved means so much more. I will be made clean. I will be restored to a normal life with God's people in God's community. I will be restored to go and worship God with my people in the temple. For 12 years, I haven't been able to do that. There's been this very, very visual, real blockage in her experience between her and her Maker. Her longing in verse 28 is, if I just touch his clothes, I will be saved. And in verse 29, we're told immediately her bleeding stopped and she was healed. And then look at verse 34 just to see this again. Verse 34, Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has... But it's not. Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering, be healed. You see, the difficulty with trying to help us in verse 34 is that this translation is saying the same thing twice. Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be healed. It doesn't say that. Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed. You see, Jesus stops her, I think, here from leaving. He stops her from leaving knowing only that she has touched the healer and been cured. He wants her to know that she has been saved. He wants her to know that she is the salvation that she longed for, that she is now cleansed, that like that Satsuma, Jesus' cleansing and purity and holiness has passed to her. She's been restored to the people of God, to the life of the people of God, restored to worshipping God. The curse has been lifted. This unnamed, suffering woman, unclean, cut off, is an example now to the entire crowd that is watching this interaction and to every person that will read Mark's Gospel after her. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Faith in me, says Jesus, has brought you salvation. And because of Jesus' care, she leaves now knowing that she is fully accepted, fully cleansed, fully loved, and she leaves as a transformed disciple of Jesus. And there's more. We'll come back to her in a second as we close. Don't worry, we're nearly there. We also see Jesus' care displayed in the life of Jairus. Again, I don't think it's too difficult, is it, for any of us to imagine. Jairus, remember, is stood during this whole incident, knowing that his daughter literally is about to die. And again, apologies for trivial examples, but when the M1 is closed and you're leaving Redbourne in a hurry and you go out to that roundabout and it's just gridlocked, isn't it, in every direction. And if you're on a tight time schedule, it's an absolute nightmare. If you ever drive north up the M1, as we do sometimes up to Birmingham, and you get down to the motorway nice and quick, and then you see that sign flashing 30. You're at the beginning of the journey, and you're going to sit there and crawl. Delays. But this, again, must be utterly excruciating for Jairus. He's fallen on his face at Jesus' feet, pleaded for Jesus to come and heal this incredibly sick daughter of his. It's the last hope, it's the only hope. And then Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" At the end of the incident in verse 35, the news that Jairus dreaded finally comes. As messengers come, verse 35, "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Again, can we begin to imagine? The messengers bring the devastating news that it's over. There is now no hope. And there's an absolute obvious human logic, isn't it, to the statement there, why bother the teacher, the rabbi, anymore? What can a rabbi do now? Even one with amazing, miraculous powers to heal, restore the use of legs, open the eyes of blind eyes, leprosy gone. 12 years of bleeding ended. But there's nothing, is there now? The words of verse 36, just look at verse 36, are absolutely astonishing, really, when you think about this situation. Overhearing or ignoring what they said, Jesus told him, essentially, don't fear, have faith. Don't fear, have faith. And again, we said over the last couple of weeks, this sort of relationship between fear and faith is there constantly in this section. In the storm, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? To the crowds, after Legion has been cleansed, they're afraid. They beg Jesus to leave. They're more afraid of Jesus than they were of the demon-possessed man. The woman is commended, verse 34. Your faith has saved you. And now Jesus is saying to Jairus, essentially, you need to imitate the faith of this woman. Don't fear, have faith. And that is a massive cultural shock in Jesus' day. For Jesus to say to Jairus, the synagogue leader and ruler, don't fear, have faith. You've just seen the kind of faith you need to exercise. Is astonishing. And so verse 37, Jesus, as sometimes he didn't let anyone follow him except Peter, James and John. They came to the home of the synagogue leader. Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. Jesus went in. Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. And they laughed at him. I don't want to say much about this, but a lot of the commentaries talk about, again, a cultural thing here, that often when a death happened, it's sort of what people would do. Not, of course, it would make sense that the family and friends would be very emotional, but this is what commentaries have said, that in the same way that we have funeral directors and we have a sort of a system around funerals and death in this country, there would be a cultural thing here which one person referred to them as professional mourners. It's what happened culturally. They would come and weep and wail, and it would be part of what happens. They say that partly because of verse 40, the fact that when Jesus says the girl is not dead but asleep, they laugh. Because perhaps for some of them, this is just sort of culturally what they do. They're not connected to the family or to the friends, and so they can move from weeping and wailing to laughter. But that's some of the thoughts around what's going on there. But Jesus puts them all out, verse 40. He simply takes the child's father and mother and his disciples who are with him, Peter, James and John, and they go in to see where the child was. Verse 41, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And they were completely astonished. We aren't told really anything more about Jairus, are we? After that, don't be afraid, have faith. We're not told any more about him other than that he went in and watched Jesus do what he did. But I just find it hard not to just imagine what's going on the inside at that moment as he sees her begin to sit up. We were, just to illustrate the sort of celebration, it was my birthday on Friday, so I didn't know I was so close to Don's. And I was out with Esther and Henry on the little 9-hole course at Redbourne, just playing 9 holes, having lots of fun. And along came a rabble, best way of describing them, 3 young lads playing very quickly. So we thought, well, we'll let them go through. And they explained they were playing this thing called a Texas Scramble, where I think they all drive, and then you pick the best ball, and then all 3 of you play from where the best ball is. It's a really fun way of playing golf. One of them hit a really good drive just short of the green, and they all moved their balls down to there. I don't know if 1 or 2 people chipped their ball onto the green. We were just watching from the top. But then one of them chipped the ball from just short of the green, up onto the green, along the green, straight in the hole. And the celebrations, you could hear these voices ringing out across the golf course. I could see fist pumping and all this sort of stuff and all that. The person doing all of that was Theo Faulkner, sat on the balcony. He did this amazing chip into the hole. And I don't know whether on the inside, I don't know what was going on with Jairus. If it was me, that's the sort of thing that would have been going, you can't believe you've lost your daughter. And now you see her in response to words spoken by this man. And all we're told by Mark, verse 41, which seems to be sort of what happens across these incidents, that they were completely astonished. Completely astonished. We see his power, the man who can raise the dead with a word. But we see his care. I listened to a really unusual talk this week, and I would recommend you to have a listen. If you type into the internet Tim Keller and this passage, you'll come across. Tim he's died recently, but was a pastor of a church in New York. And he spends most of the talk talking about the delay in this story and the impact of the delay. It's a very different way of looking at the passage, but it's very, very interesting and well worth a listen. One of the things he says in that talk, and this is where actually our translation has got this pretty good, but Tim Keller just helps you to get the feeling of it. Verse 41, Jesus takes her by the hand and he says to her, Talitha cum. And Tim Keller says, we've got here the translation, which means little girl, Talitha, little girl. And again, I'm relying on Tim Keller's knowledge of Greek here. He said it is little girl. He said it's almost, you might say, little lady. He says it's the sense of a parent with their child, their daughter, little lady. And cum is, as it says there, I say to you, get up. But it comes with the sense of it's time to get up. So it's almost what you'd see perhaps with Jairus and his wife going in to wake up their 12-year-old daughter, science first lesson, dead in the bed, doesn't want to wake up, and taking her by the hand or putting her hand on the back, little lady, it's time to get up. There's something incredibly gentle and caring and loving about what Jesus does here. One of the confusing things about this passage is the delay and all that means. But the delay was necessary here for this woman's proper care and for her maturity as a disciple of Jesus. And the delay here for Jairus seems to mean that the fact that he was hoping for a spectacular healing and ends up with a resurrection. Not a healing, but a resurrection. And again, one of the things across these two stories is that, and the one from last week, we don't know where their storylines go. We don't know what it meant for this woman to be stopped and called back and to have a public engagement with Jesus. We don't know what difference that would have made in this woman's life. We don't know what difference that would have made in those around them in the crowd. We don't know what difference it's made, the fact that Jairus, his daughter, wasn't another healing, but actually a resurrection. We don't know how God will use that in the life of Jairus or his wife or his family or his relatives. But we see Jesus, yes, with power over nature and evil, sickness and death. We see him coming on the slide into a fallen, evil world, chaotic and disordered, with total kingly control. And yet we see him too with total care and love for the individuals in these stories. And I want to leave you this morning with the thought that as we navigate this world, as we navigate the chaos, as we navigate the disorder, as we live in a fallen world, as we live in situations that would bring about fear in us, I wonder if we'll hear the words of Jesus. Don't fear. Trust me. Have faith. I am with you always to the very end of the age. When disaster strikes, when evil appears to be getting a grip, where disease has its hold, where death looms, don't fear, for the King of the universe is with you. Have faith. Trust me. You may not know why the delay is there. You may not know why this is happening and that is happening. You may never know. but trust me. Faith in me saves for all eternity. Put your hand in mine. Trust me.